Tonight, as you settle into the comfort of your bed and prepare to drift into peaceful slumber, let me carry you across the vast Pacific Ocean to the scattered islands of Polynesia, where the waves whisper ancient secrets and the stars themselves tell stories of heroes who shaped the world. In these tranquil waters, where time moves as gently as the ocean currents, there lived a being whose adventures would echo through generations, whose courage would inspire countless souls, and whose mischievous spirit would forever change the relationship between gods and mortals. This is the complete story of Maui, the legendary trickster hero whose exploits stretch from the creation of islands to the theft of fire itself. As the gentle rhythm of my voice guides you toward rest, allow yourself to be transported to a world where shapeshifters walk among mortals, where gods dwell in hidden realms, and where one extraordinary being dared to challenge the very foundations of existence for the benefit of humanity. What makes Maui's tale so perfectly suited for these quiet hours before sleep is not merely its epic scope or mythological grandeur, but the way it unfolds like the slow, steady rhythm of waves upon a peaceful shore. Each adventure builds upon the last, creating a tapestry of wonder that will carry you gently into dreams filled with tropical islands, starlit skies, and the timeless magic of Polynesian storytelling. Our journey begins not with grand proclamations or dramatic fanfare, but with the subtle mystery of an unusual birth, a divine intervention that would set the stage for adventures spanning the entire Pacific. In the soft glow of ancient fires, under skies painted with the Southern Cross, the people of Polynesia have passed down this story for over 1,000 years, and tonight it becomes your gateway to peaceful rest. The story of Maui opens in the misty realm between mortal and divine, in a time when the boundaries between these worlds were far more fluid than they are today. His mother, Taranga, was no ordinary woman, but a being of supernatural heritage, connected to the ancient powers that governed the ocean and sky. She possessed the ability to transform into various forms, a gift that would prove crucial in the events that were to unfold. Taranga's pregnancy with Maui was marked by strange omens and unusual occurrences that suggested this child would be different from her other sons. The ocean itself seemed to respond to her presence, with dolphins following her wherever she walked along the shoreline, and seabirds gathering in unusually large numbers around her dwelling. The other women of her village noticed that flowers bloomed more vibrantly in her presence, and that the fishing nets brought in larger catches when she blessed them with her touch. When the time came for Maui's birth, Taranga retreated to a sacred grove where the ancient trees whispered secrets known only to the gods. It was here, surrounded by the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant sound of waves, that she gave birth to a child who appeared stillborn, his tiny form showing no signs of life. In her grief and desperation, believing she had lost this precious child, Taranga made a decision that would alter the course of Polynesian mythology forever. She wrapped the seemingly lifeless infant in her hair, creating a cocoon of protection and love, and carried him to the edge of the ocean. The ancient customs of her people dictated that children who did not survive birth should be returned to the sea, to be embraced by the eternal waters from which all life emerged. With tears streaming down her face, Taranga placed the small bundle into the gentle waves, whispering prayers to the ocean spirits and asking them to care for her child in the realm beyond mortal understanding. But the ocean had different plans for this special child. As the bundle containing Maui drifted away from shore, carried by currents that seemed to move with deliberate purpose, the sea creatures began to take notice. Schools of fish swam alongside the floating bundle, as if providing an honor guard for something precious. Seabirds circled overhead, their calls creating a haunting melody that spoke of ancient mysteries and divine intervention. The bundle eventually washed ashore on a remote beach, far from human habitation, where it was discovered by Tamanui Kiterangi, Maui's divine ancestor, whose name meant Great Son of the Heavens. This powerful being, who existed in the space between mortal and immortal realms, recognized immediately that this was no ordinary child, but one destined for extraordinary things. With gentle hands that had shaped the islands and guided stars, Tamanui Kiterangi unwrapped the bundle and breathed life into the tiny form. Maui's eyes opened for the first time, not to the face of his mortal mother, but to the ancient and wise features of his divine grandfather. In that moment, as life sparked within him, Maui absorbed not only the breath of existence, but also the magical essence that would make him capable of feats beyond normal human ability. His revival was accompanied by signs that even the gods took notice of his return to life. The aurora danced across the sky in patterns never before seen, and the very stars seemed to pulse with renewed brightness. Under the care of Tamanui Kiterangi, Maui grew rapidly, not just in physical stature, but in understanding of the magical forces that governed the world around him. His divine grandfather became his first teacher, instructing him in the arts of shapeshifting, the secrets of navigating by the stars, and the complex relationships between the various gods and spirits that inhabited the Polynesian cosmos. The young Maui displayed an insatiable curiosity about everything around him, constantly asking questions that sometimes even his wise grandfather found challenging to answer. He wanted to know why the sun moved across the sky, why some islands were larger than others, why mortals could not fly like birds or swim like dolphins. This questioning nature, combined with his divine heritage, would eventually drive him to take actions that would reshape the very foundations of the world. As Maui matured under his grandfather's guidance, he began to develop the personality traits that would define his legendary status. He possessed an irrepressible sense of humor, often playing pranks that demonstrated his growing magical abilities. He could transform into various animals at will, a skill he used both for practical purposes and for the sheer joy of experiencing the world from different perspectives. His grandfather taught him the sacred chants and rituals that connected him to his divine ancestry, showing him how to call upon the power of his celestial lineage when facing challenges that required more than mortal strength. These lessons were conducted in secret locations, hidden from the eyes of both mortals and lesser spirits who might not understand the magnitude of power being cultivated in this seemingly playful young being. But perhaps most importantly, Tamanui Kiterangi instilled in Maui a deep love for humanity and a desire to use his extraordinary abilities for their benefit. Through stories and direct observation, Maui learned about the struggles faced by mortal people, their difficulty in obtaining fire, their challenges in fishing and farming, their vulnerability to the whims of nature and the gods. These lessons planted the seeds of compassion that would motivate many of his future heroic deeds. The time eventually came when Tamanui Kite Rangi determined that Maui was ready to rejoin the mortal world and reconnect with his birth family. This transition would not be simple, as years had passed since his apparent death, and his mother Taranga had mourned him and moved forward with her life. Moreover, Maui now possessed abilities and knowledge that set him apart from ordinary mortals, creating potential complications in re-establishing familial bonds. The reunion between Maui and his family forms one of the most emotionally complex episodes in his story, revealing the challenges faced by one who exists between two worlds. When Maui first approached his mother's dwelling, now a young man of extraordinary appearance and bearing, Taranga did not immediately recognize him as the child she had lost to the sea. His divine upbringing had given him an otherworldly quality that marked him as different from her other sons, who had grown up as normal mortals in their island community. Maui's brothers, who had never known of his existence, viewed this stranger with suspicion and curiosity. They had grown accustomed to their positions within the family hierarchy and were not entirely pleased to discover they had an additional sibling whose very presence seemed to shift the dynamics of their household. The four brothers each had their own distinct personalities and abilities, but none possessed the magical powers that made Maui so unique. The process of integration required patience and wisdom from all involved. Taranga, once she understood who Maui truly was, experienced a complex mixture of joy at his return and concern about the implications of his divine transformation. She recognized that her son was no longer entirely mortal, and this realization brought both pride and worry about what his future might hold. It's during this period of adjustment, Maui began to demonstrate the extent of his abilities to his family, though he was careful not to overwhelm them with displays of power that might create fear rather than wonder. He showed them his skill at fishing, bringing in catches larger than any the family had ever seen. He entertained them with his shape-shifting abilities, transforming into various birds and sea creatures that delighted and amazed his brothers. But it was Maui's intelligence and problem-solving abilities that truly set him apart from his siblings. When challenges arose within their community, whether related to food shortages, territorial disputes with neighboring groups, or difficulties with fishing and agriculture, Maui invariably proposed solutions that others had not considered. His unique perspective, shaped by his divine education and his ability to see beyond the limitations that constrained ordinary thinking, made him an invaluable member of his family and community. As word of Maui's remarkable abilities spread throughout their island, he began to attract attention from both admirers and those who viewed his powers with suspicion. Some community members saw him as a blessing, a divine gift that could help solve problems that had plagued them for generations. Others worried that his presence might anger the gods or disrupt the natural order that had governed their lives for countless years. This growing reputation set the stage for the adventures that would establish Maui as one of Polynesia's greatest heroes, each deed building upon the last to create a legacy that would inspire generations of storytellers and dreamers. The foundation had been laid through his unusual birth, divine upbringing, and complex reintegration into mortal society. preparing him for the challenges and triumphs that lay ahead in his extraordinary journey across the Pacific world. The first great adventure that would establish Maui's reputation as a hero of legendary proportions began with a problem that affected every person living on the scattered islands of Polynesia. In those ancient times, the islands were much smaller than they are today, barely rising above the ocean's surface, providing only the most meager living space for the growing populations that called them home. Families were crowded together on narrow strips of land, and there was constant concern about having enough space for growing food, building homes, and raising children in safety. Maui observed these struggles with the keen eye of someone who had been taught to see beyond immediate circumstances to underlying solutions. While others accepted the limitations of their small island homes as unchangeable facts of life, Maui's divine education had taught him that seemingly impossible problems often had elegant solutions waiting to be discovered by those bold enough to attempt them. The inspiration for his solution came during one of his fishing expeditions with his brothers. As they paddled their canoe across the deep blue waters between islands, Maui noticed how the ocean floor seemed to rise and fall in patterns that suggested hidden land masses lying just beneath the surface. His supernatural vision allowed him to perceive what others could not see, revealing vast underwater mountains and valleys that could potentially be raised to create new islands or expand existing ones. When Maui shared this observation with his brothers, they initially dismissed it as another of his fanciful ideas. They had grown accustomed to his unusual way of seeing the world, but the notion of actually pulling land from the ocean floor seemed beyond even his considerable abilities. Their skepticism only served to fuel Maui's determination to prove that what seemed impossible to others was merely another challenge waiting to be overcome through cleverness and divine power. The preparation for this undertaking required Maui to call upon knowledge and skills that went far beyond ordinary fishing techniques. He needed to create a fish hook unlike any that had ever been crafted, one strong enough to catch not fish, but the very foundations of the earth itself. This would require materials and methods that transcended the physical realm, drawing upon the spiritual connections that linked him to his divine ancestry. Working in secret during the quiet hours when his family slept, Maui began fashioning his magical fish hook from the most sacred materials he could obtain. The process involved not just physical craftsmanship, but also spiritual preparation, as he performed ancient rituals and chanted sacred formulas that would imbue the hook with the power necessary for his unprecedented task. The hook itself was carved from the jawbone of his divine ancestor, a relic that contained within it the accumulated mana of countless generations of celestial beings. As Maui shaped and polished this sacred bone, he whispered prayers and incantations that awakened the dormant power within the ancient material. The resulting fish hook gleamed with an inner light that spoke of its supernatural nature, pulsing with energy that seemed to echo the rhythm of the ocean's deepest currents. But the creations of the magical fish hook was only the first step in Maui's ambitious plan. He also needed to prepare fishing line strong enough to bear the weight of entire land masses being pulled from the ocean floor. This required him to weave together not ordinary plant fibers, but strands of his own divine essence, creating a cord that could withstand forces that would snap any earthly rope. The night chosen for this great undertaking was carefully selected according to astronomical calculations that took into account the positions of stars and the phases of the moon. Maui understood that certain celestial alignments would amplify his magical abilities, providing the additional power necessary to accomplish something that had never been attempted before. When the appointed time arrived, Maui invited his brothers to join him on what he described as a special fishing expedition. He was deliberately vague about his true intentions, knowing that their skepticism might interfere with the delicate spiritual preparations required for success. The brothers, accustomed to Maui's secretive ways and always curious about his latest schemes, agreed to accompany him despite their uncertainty about what he had planned. As their canoe moved through the dark waters, illuminated only by starlight, Maui guided them to a location far from any visible land, where the ocean depths held secrets known only to those with divine sight. The water here was so deep that it appeared almost black, and the silence was broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against their canoe and the distant calls of seabirds navigating by celestial landmarks. Maui's brothers watched with growing amazement as he prepared his magical fishing line, revealing for the first time the extraordinary hook he had created. Even in the dim starlight, they could see that this was no ordinary fishing implement, but something that seemed to pulse with its own inner fire. The hook cast strange shadows that moved independently of the light source, and touching the fishing line produced a tingling sensation that spoke of contained power waiting to be released. Without explaining his full intentions, Maui cast his magical fishhook into the depths, allowing it to sink far deeper than any normal fishing line could reach. As it descended through layers of water that grew progressively colder and darker, the hook sought out its target with the precision of a guided arrow drawn by forces that operated beyond the realm of ordinary fishing. The brothers waited in puzzled silence as minutes stretched into what seemed like hours, their canoe rocking gently on the calm surface, while Maui maintained his focused concentration on the invisible line stretching into the depths below them. They could sense that something extraordinary was happening, but the nature of their brother's undertaking remained mysterious until the moment when his fishing line suddenly grew taut with a tension that threatened to overturn their small vessel. What happened next would be remembered and retold throughout Polynesia for countless generations as Maui began the slow, methodical process of pulling entire islands from the ocean floor. The strain on his divine muscles was enormous, requiring him to draw upon every ounce of supernatural strength he possessed, while his brothers struggled to maintain their balance in a canoe that was being pulled through the water by forces beyond their comprehension. The first sign of success came when the water around their canoe began to change color, shifting from deep blue to the lighter shades that indicated rising sea floor. Bubbles began appearing on the surface, and the ocean itself seemed to heave and pulse as something vast began rising from the depths. The brothers realized with growing excitement and terror that their seemingly impossible brother was actually succeeding in his incredible undertaking. As Maui continued his steady pulling, guided by strength that flowed from his divine heritage and determination that refused to accept failure, the first peaks of new land began breaking the surface around their canoe. What had been empty ocean moments before was now becoming solid ground, with rocky outcroppings and sandy beaches emerging from water that had covered them for countless ages. The process was gradual but relentless, as more and more land rose from the depths, creating not just small additions to existing islands, but entirely new land masses that would provide homes for future generations. Maui's brothers watched in awe as forests of coral and underwater mountains transformed into the foundations of what would become some of Polynesia's most beautiful and fertile islands. But the greatest test of Maui's undertaking was yet to come, as the physical strain of pulling such massive amounts of land from the ocean floor began to take its toll even on his superhuman endurance. The magical fishhook, though crafted from sacred materials, was beginning to show signs of stress under the unprecedented load it was being asked to bear. The fishing line, woven from Maui's own divine essence, stretched taut as it transmitted forces that would have shattered any earthly cord. The moment of greatest peril came when Maui's eldest brother, overcome by curiosity and concern for his siblings' tremendous exertion, turned to look behind them at the miraculous sight unfolding across the ocean's surface. The ancient warnings passed down through generations of island peoples had always spoken of the importance of maintaining faith and focus during sacred undertakings, but the spectacle of entire land masses rising from the depths proved too compelling to ignore. As his brother's gaze fell upon the emerging islands, the delicate spiritual balance that Maui had so carefully maintained throughout his Herculean effort suddenly shattered like fragile coral struck by a powerful wave. The magical connection between the divine fishhook and the ocean floor wavered, and Maui felt the tremendous weight he had been steadily lifting begin to slip back toward the depths. With a sound like thunder rolling across still waters, the fishing line snapped, sending shock waves through both the physical and spiritual realms. The islands that Maui had successfully raised remained permanently above the surface, but many more that were still in the process of emerging sank back into the ocean's embrace, leaving only the peaks of underwater mountains and the promise of what might have been. Despite this setback, Maui's first great feat had fundamentally altered the geography of the Pacific, creating new homes and expanding existing islands in ways that would benefit countless generations of Polynesian peoples. The success, though incomplete, established his reputation as a hero capable of accomplishing the impossible and set the stage for even greater adventures that would follow. The news of Maui's incredible achievement spread across the island chains like ripples from a stone cast into calm water. Storytellers and travelers carried tales of the young hero who had pulled land from the ocean floor, and with each telling, the story grew in wonder and significance. Chiefs and commoners alike spoke of the expanded territories that now provided space for growing populations, fertile soil for agriculture, and protected harbors for fishing fleets. But Maui himself was not content to rest on the acclaim his first great deed had brought him. His divine education had instilled in him an understanding that true heroism required continuous effort to improve the lives of those around him, and he could see that his people still faced numerous challenges that his unique abilities might help resolve. One of the most pressing problems affecting every person throughout Polynesia was the brevity of daylight hours, which limited the time available for essential activities like fishing, farming, and crafting. The sun raced across the sky with such speed that people barely had enough time to complete their daily tasks before darkness fell and forced them to cease their productive work. Maui observed how his mother Taranga struggled to complete her weaving projects, how fishermen were forced to return to shore just as the fish were beginning to bite, and how farmers could barely tend their crops before the sun disappeared behind the horizon. This universal problem affected rich and poor alike, creating inefficiencies and hardships that seemed to be accepted as unchangeable facts of life. The solution that formed in Maui's innovative mind was characteristically bold and seemingly impossible. Rather than accepting the sun's rapid passage as an immutable aspect of nature, he began contemplating ways to slow its journey across the sky, providing more daylight hours for human activities and improving life for everyone throughout the Pacific Islands. His investigation into this challenge led him to seek out the wisdom of ancient storytellers and spiritual advisors who possessed a knowledge of the sun's nature and habits. Through patient questioning and careful observation, Maui learned that the sun was not merely a distant ball of fire, but a conscious entity with its own personality, preferences, and daily routines. According to the most sacred traditions, the sun had grown lazy over countless years of traveling the same path across the sky, racing through its journey so quickly that it barely paused to appreciate the beauty of the islands below or consider the needs of the people who depended on its light. This laziness had gradually worsened over time, making the days shorter and shorter as the sun became increasingly eager to complete its obligations and rest. Armed with this understanding, Maui began developing a plan that would require all of his cunning, strength, and magical abilities. He would need to capture the sun itself, hold it against its will, and negotiate new terms for its daily journey that would provide adequate daylight for human activities while still respecting the cosmic order that governed celestial movements. The preparation for this unprecedented undertaking required Maui to travel to the eastern edge of the world, where the sun began each day's journey across the sky. This remote location was known to exist, but had never been visited by mortals, as the journey required crossing vast expanses of ocean and navigating by stars that few people understood. Maui's divine heritage and supernatural abilities made him uniquely qualified for this expedition, but even he recognized that success would require careful planning and the creation of specialized equipment capable of restraining a celestial being. The ropes that would be needed to bind the sun could not be woven from ordinary materials, but would have to incorporate elements of divine power and spiritual significance. Working in secret once again, Maui began crafting the most extraordinary ropes ever created, weaving together strands of his sister's hair with fibers from sacred plants that grew only in locations touched by divine presence. Each strand was blessed with ancient incantations and imbued with magical properties that would allow it to maintain its strength even when exposed to the sun's tremendous heat and radiant energy. The creation of these magical ropes took many weeks of careful work, as Maui needed to ensure that each strand would hold under conditions that would instantly destroy any earthly cordage. He tested his materials by exposing them to the flames of sacred fires and the heat of volcanic springs, gradually refining his technique until he had produced ropes that glowed with their own inner light and pulsed with contained power. As word of Maui's latest project began to spread through his family and community, the reactions were mixed between admiration for his ambition and concern about the potential consequences of interfering with celestial mechanics. Some elders warned that attempting to constrain the sun might anger other divine beings and bring about cosmic disasters that could affect the entire Pacific region. But Maui's confidence in his abilities and his genuine desire to help his people overcame these concerns, and he began preparing for the long journey to the eastern edge of the world, where the sun emerged each morning from its underground sleeping chambers. This expedition would require him to travel alone, as no ordinary person could survive the intense heat and supernatural forces that existed near the sun's dwelling place. The journey itself became an adventure of epic proportions, as Maui navigated by stars that guided him across ocean expanses where no islands provided rest or shelter. He sustained himself through his divine nature and the magical provisions he had prepared, transforming into various seabirds when he needed to cover great distances quickly, or diving deep as a whale when storms threatened to overwhelm his canoe. After weeks of travel that took him far beyond the familiar waters of his homeland, Maui finally reached the legendary location where the sun began each day's journey. The landscape here was unlike anything found in the inhabited regions of Polynesia, with volcanic formations that glowed with inner fire and springs of water so hot they produced clouds of steam that obscured the horizon. Hidden among these otherworldly features, Maui discovered the cave where the sun rested during the hours of darkness, recuperating from its daily flight across the sky and preparing for the next morning's journey. The entrance to this cave was guarded by supernatural beings who served as the sun's attendants, but Maui's shape-shifting abilities allowed him to approach undetected by transforming into creatures that belonged naturally in this celestial environment. The interior of the sun's cave was a marvel of divine architecture, with chambers carved from crystalline rock that refracted and amplified light in patterns that created rainbows of impossible beauty. The sun itself, when Maui finally glimpsed it in its resting state, appeared not as the blazing orb visible from Earth, but as a magnificent being of pure energy and consciousness, surrounded by attendant spirits who maintained its divine essence. Maui spent several nights observing the sun's routines and habits, learning the precise timing of its departure each morning, and identifying the best location for implementing his audacious plan. He discovered that the sun emerged from its cave through a narrow passage that would provide the perfect bottleneck for his rope trap, allowing him to ensnare the celestial being before it could build up the momentum that carried it so swiftly across the sky. The morning chosen for his great attempt arrived with conditions that seemed blessed by divine favor. The sky was clear, the winds were calm, and Maui's magical ropes hummed with contained energy that spoke of their readiness for the unprecedented task ahead. Positioning himself at the mouth of the sun's cave, concealed behind formations of volcanic rock, Maui prepared his trap with the precision of a master craftsman and the patience of an experienced hunter. As the first light of dawn began to emanate from the cave's depths, Maui knew that the moment of truth was approaching. The sun's attendant spirits began their morning rituals, preparing their master for another day's journey across the heavens, unaware that a mortal hero waited outside with plans to fundamentally alter the cosmic order that had governed their existence since the beginning of time. The sun emerged from its cave with the majestic power that had carried it across countless skies, its radiance immediately transforming the surrounding landscape into a realm of golden light and dancing shadows. But as it passed through the narrow opening where Maui had positioned his magical snares, the divine ropes sprang into action with the precision of a masterfully executed plan. The sun found itself suddenly entangled in bonds that tightened with each struggle, held fast by ropes that had been crafted specifically to contain celestial energy and divine power. Its initial reaction was one of shock and outrage at this unprecedented interference with its ancient prerogatives, followed by increasingly frantic attempts to break free from the constraints that held it captive. Maui emerged from his concealment to face the captured sun, his own divine nature protecting him from the intense heat and blinding radiance that would have instantly destroyed any ordinary mortal. The confrontation that followed would be remembered as one of the most dramatic negotiations in Polynesian mythology, as hero and celestial being engaged in a battle of wills that would determine the future of daylight throughout the Pacific Islands. The negotiations between Maui and the captured sun unfolded not as the violent confrontation one might expect between mortal and divine forces, but as a careful diplomatic exchange between two beings who recognized each other's legitimate concerns and capabilities. The sun, despite its initial anger at being constrained against its will, possessed the wisdom of countless ages and understood that this unprecedented situation required thoughtful consideration rather than mere displays of celestial power. Maui began the conversation with the respect due to a divine entity, acknowledging the sun's essential role in maintaining life throughout the Pacific Islands while explaining the genuine hardships that its hasty daily journey was causing for the mortal populations below. He spoke of children who barely had time to play before darkness fell, of elderly craftspeople whose failing eyesight required more light to complete their intricate work, and of farmers whose crops suffered from insufficient exposure to the sun's life-giving rays. The sun listened to these arguments with growing understanding, gradually realizing that its eagerness to complete each day's journey and return to rest had indeed created unintended consequences for the beings who depended on its presence. In its vast cosmic perspective, the sun had not fully appreciated how its actions affected the smaller, shorter-lived creatures whose entire existence played out in the brief moments of its daily passage across the sky. As their discussion continued, the sun began to see Maui not as an impudent mortal who had dared to interfere with divine prerogatives, but as a legitimate advocate for those who lacked the power to speak for themselves in cosmic affairs. This recognition led to a gradual shift in their relationship from captor and prisoner to negotiating partners seeking a solution that would benefit all parties involved. The compromise they eventually reached represented a masterpiece of diplomatic problem solving that satisfied both the sun's need for reasonable rest periods and humanity's requirement for adequate daylight hours. The sun agreed to slow its passage across the sky, providing longer days during the seasons when people most needed extended daylight for planting, harvesting, and other essential activities that sustained island communities. In exchange for this concession, Maui promised to release the sun from its magical bonds and to ensure that no other mortal would attempt similar interference with celestial operations. He also agreed to use his influence among the island populations to establish proper rituals and observances that would honor the sun's sacrifice and express gratitude for the gift of extended daylight. The implementation of their agreement required careful attention to the mechanics of celestial movement and the complex relationships between various cosmic forces that governed natural cycles throughout the Pacific region. The sun could not simply slow its movement without considering the effects on tides, weather patterns, and the navigation systems that island peoples used for their ocean voyages. Working together, Maui and the sun developed a graduated system of seasonal variations that would provide the longest days during summer months when agricultural activities reached their peak intensity, while maintaining shorter winter days that allowed for proper rest and reflection during the dormant seasons. This natural rhythm would become the foundation for agricultural calendars and ceremonial cycles that would guide island societies for generations to come. The magical ropes that had captured the sun were not simply discarded once their primary purpose had been fulfilled, but were transformed into lasting symbols of the agreement between divine and mortal realms. Some were woven into the very fabric of the sky, becoming the rays of sunlight that reached Earth each day, while others were given to trusted spiritual leaders who would use them in ceremonies designed to maintain the balance between human needs and cosmic order. When Maui finally released the sun from its constraints, the celestial being rose into the sky with a measured pace that immediately demonstrated the success of their negotiations. The people throughout Polynesia noticed the change instantly, as their days stretched longer and provided ample time for completing essential tasks without the frantic rush that had previously characterized daily life. The return journey from the edge of the world gave Maui time to reflect on the implications of his achievement and to plan how he would share this success with his family and community. Unlike his previous feat of pulling islands from the ocean floor, this accomplishment had no visible physical evidence beyond the extended daylight hours that everyone could experience directly. The challenge of explaining his absence and the sudden change in the sun's behavior required Maui to draw upon his storytelling abilities and his understanding of how people processed extraordinary claims. He knew that simply announcing he had captured and negotiated with the sun would strain credibility, even among those who had witnessed his previous miraculous deeds. Instead, he chose to reveal his achievement gradually through demonstrations of his knowledge about the sun's new patterns and his ability to predict exactly how the extended daylight would affect various seasonal activities. This approach allowed people to observe the benefits of longer days while slowly accepting the remarkable story of how these benefits had been obtained. The success of Maui's solar negotiation established him as more than just a powerful individual capable of extraordinary feats, but as a mediator between different realms of existence who could advocate effectively for mortal interests in divine affairs. This reputation would prove invaluable in future adventures that required him to interact with other supernatural beings and navigate the complex politics of the cosmic order. But even as communities throughout the Pacific began adapting to their improved daylight schedules, Maui remained keenly aware of other challenges that continued to affect his people's daily lives. The longer days had indeed made many activities easier, but they had also highlighted problems that had previously been obscured by the limitations of abbreviated daylight hours. One issue that became increasingly apparent was the difficulty many communities faced in obtaining and maintaining fire for cooking, warmth, and light during the extended evening hours that were now available for productive activities. Fire-making techniques of the time were laborious and unreliable, often requiring hours of effort to produce even small flames that could easily be extinguished by wind or rain. The process typically involved rubbing together specific types of wood in precise patterns while maintaining exactly the right pressure and rhythm, a skill that required considerable practice and physical endurance. Many families depended on keeping fires burning continuously, rather than attempting to create new ones when needed, which meant that accidents or weather conditions that extinguished their flames could leave them without this essential resource for days at a time. Maui observed these difficulties with the same analytical perspective that had led him to his previous innovations, recognizing that the problem was not merely technical, but involved fundamental questions about the relationship between mortals and the forces that controlled essential resources. Fire, like daylight, was ultimately controlled by divine powers who had established the conditions under which it could be accessed and maintained. His investigation into the nature of fire and its divine governance led Maui into contact with spiritual traditions and mythological knowledge that revealed fire to be not simply a physical phenomenon, but a sacred force with its own complex hierarchy of supernatural guardians and celestial origins. This understanding opened up possibilities for solutions that went far beyond improving existing fire-making techniques. The most intriguing information Maui discovered concerned the existence of an original source of fire that was maintained in the divine realm by supernatural beings who had never shared this resource with mortals. This celestial fire burned eternally without fuel, never dimmed or flickered, and possessed qualities that made it far superior to any flames that could be produced through earthly methods. According to the most ancient traditions, this divine fire had been deliberately withheld from humanity by cosmic authorities who believed that mortals were not ready to handle such powerful forces responsibly. The decision to restrict access to celestial fire was based on concerns that humans might use unlimited fire for destructive purposes, or might become dependent on divine resources instead of developing their own capabilities. But Maui's successful negotiations with the sun had demonstrated that mortals could indeed interact responsibly with cosmic forces when proper respect and understanding guided their actions. This precedent suggested that the restrictions on divine fire might be reconsidered if approached through appropriate channels and with adequate justification for the benefits such access would provide. The location of the celestial fire was known to exist in the underworld realm, guarded by Mahuika, an ancient and powerful grandmother figure whose dominion over fire extended throughout both mortal and divine spheres. Mahuika was described in traditional stories as a being of immense wisdom and terrible power, capable of controlling every flame that had ever existed and determining who would be granted access to fire's benefits. Unlike his previous adventures, which had taken him to remote but physically accessible locations, reaching Mahuika's underworld domain would require Maui to journey into spiritual realms that existed beyond the normal boundaries of mortal experience. This type of travel demanded not just physical courage and supernatural abilities, but also spiritual preparation that would protect his essential nature during encounters with forces that operated according to different laws than those governing the surface world. The descent into the underworld began at a sacred location where volcanic activity created natural openings between different levels of reality, allowing properly prepared individuals to pass from the mortal realm into the deeper spiritual dimensions where divine forces maintained their most essential operations. These volcanic passages were guarded by various supernatural beings who tested travelers to ensure they possessed both the authority and the spiritual development necessary for safe passage. Maui's divine heritage provided him with certain protections during this journey, but he still needed to demonstrate his worthiness through trials that challenged his understanding of cosmic relationships and his commitment to using any powers he might gain for beneficial rather than selfish purposes. These tests took forms that reflected the specific nature of fire as both a creative and destructive force, requiring him to show that he could handle such power with appropriate wisdom. The underworld realm itself was unlike anything Maui had encountered in his previous adventures, with landscapes that shifted according to spiritual principles rather than physical laws, and inhabitants whose appearances reflected their inner natures rather than biological requirements. The very air seemed to pulse with contained energy, and distances were measured not in physical space, but in degrees of spiritual development and understanding. Mahuika's domain within this realm was characterized by the presence of fires that burned in impossible colors and patterns, creating illumination that revealed the truths normally hidden from mortal perception, while casting shadows that seemed to contain their own forms of consciousness. The grandmother of fire herself appeared as a figure whose age spoke of wisdom accumulated over cosmic time periods, with eyes that held the memory of every flame that had ever existed, and hands that could shape fire as easily as mortals might mold clay. The initial meeting between Maui and Mahuika unfolded with the careful formality appropriate to encounters between beings whose actions could affect the fundamental conditions of existence throughout multiple realms. Mahuika recognized immediately that her visitor was no ordinary mortal, but someone whose divine connections and previous achievements had earned him the right to request audience with cosmic authorities. Their conversation began not with Maui's specific request for fire, but with a broader discussion of his motivations and the principles that guided his interventions in cosmic affairs. Mahuika needed to understand whether his desire for fire stemmed from genuine concern for mortal welfare or from personal ambition that might lead to misuse of such powerful resources. As their dialogue progressed, Maui found himself engaging with a form of wisdom that surpassed even his grandfather's teachings, as Mahuika possessed understanding that encompassed not only the technical aspects of fire control, but also the deeper philosophical questions about the proper relationship between divine gifts and mortal responsibility. Her questions challenged him to articulate exactly how access to divine fire would benefit humanity without creating new problems or dependencies. The testing phase of their interaction took the form of challenges that required Maui to demonstrate his worthiness through actions rather than mere words, as Mahuika created scenarios that revealed his true character under conditions of stress and temptation. These trials were designed to show whether he would use fire-related powers for selfish gain or maintain his commitment to improving conditions for all people throughout the Pacific Islands. One particularly significant test involved Mahuika temporarily granting Maui control over various types of fire to observe how he would handle such power when faced with different situations that might tempt him to abuse his abilities. She created illusions of enemies who could be defeated with fire, treasures that could be obtained through controlled burning, and personal comforts that unlimited flame could provide, watching carefully to see how he would respond to these temptations. Maui's performance during these trials demonstrated the wisdom he had gained through his previous adventures and his genuine commitment to using his abilities for beneficial purposes rather than personal advancement. His restraint in situations where fire could have provided easy solutions to personal challenges, combined with his creative applications of flame to solve problems affecting entire communities, convinced Mahuika that he could be trusted with access to divine fire. The final phase of their negotiation involved working out the specific terms under which divine fire would be made available to mortals, including the conditions that would govern its use and the responsibilities that would accompany access to such powerful resources. These discussions required careful consideration of how unlimited fire might affect existing social relationships, economic systems, and environmental conditions throughout the Pacific region. The solution they developed involved not simply giving mortals direct access to celestial fire, but instead teaching them improved techniques for creating and maintaining earthly flames, while also establishing spiritual connections that would make fire making more reliable and efficient. This approach provided significant benefits while maintaining the distinction between divine and mortal realms that cosmic order required. Mahuika agreed to place a spark of divine fire within certain materials that mortals could access, making fire starting faster and more reliable while still requiring skill and effort that would maintain proper respect for fire's power. She also established spiritual connections that would allow experienced fire keepers to sense the best times and conditions for creating flames, reducing the uncertainty that had previously made fire maintenance so challenging. The implementation of these improvements required Mahuika to modify the essential nature of various fire-making materials found throughout Polynesia, imbuing them with traces of divine essence that would respond more readily to proper techniques while remaining dormant under inappropriate conditions. This careful balance ensured that fire would be more accessible to those who approached it with proper respect, while remaining difficult for those who might seek to misuse its power. The return journey from the underworld provided Maui with opportunities to test and refine his understanding of the new fire-making techniques that Mahuika had taught him, ensuring that he could effectively share this knowledge with his family and community upon his return to the surface world. The improved methods proved to be remarkably effective, producing flames quickly and reliably, even under conditions that would have made traditional fire making impossible. When Maui finally emerged from the volcanic passages that had carried him into the underworld, he brought with him not only the knowledge of improved fire-making techniques, but also a deeper understanding of the responsibilities that accompanied access to divine resources. His successful negotiation with Mahuika had established new precedents for cooperation between mortal and divine realms while providing practical benefits that would improve daily life throughout the Pacific Islands. The introduction of these enhanced fire-making methods to his community created immediate and dramatic improvements in their quality of life, as families no longer needed to worry about accidentally extinguishing their fires or spending hours attempting to create new flames when needed. The reliability of fire access made it practical to extend productive activities into the evening hours that Maui's solar negotiations had made available, creating a synergistic effect that multiplied the benefits of both achievements. The success of Maui's fire quest resonated throughout the scattered islands, like the warmth of a newly kindled flame spreading through a darkened dwelling. Communities that had previously struggled with the constant anxiety of maintaining their precious fires now found themselves able to focus their energies on pursuits that had been impossible when so much time and effort was required simply to keep flames alive through wind and rain. The enhanced fire-making techniques that Maui shared were not merely technical improvements, but represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between humans and one of nature's most essential forces. Where families had once huddled around carefully tended embers, fearful that a single mistake might leave them cold and hungry, they now possessed the confidence to explore new applications of fire that enriched their daily lives in countless ways. Cooking became an art form rather than a desperate race against dying flames, as island dwellers experimented with different combinations of foods and cooking methods that had been too risky to attempt when fire was scarce and unreliable. The ability to create flames quickly and consistently meant that meals could be prepared fresh rather than kept warm for extended periods, leading to improvements in both nutrition and flavor that enhanced the health and happiness of entire communities. The extended evening hours that Maui's solar negotiations had provided became venues for new forms of social interaction and cultural development, as reliable fire made it practical to gather after dark for storytelling, music, and crafts that had previously been confined to the limited daylight hours. These evening gatherings strengthened community bonds while providing opportunities for passing down traditional knowledge and developing new artistic expressions that reflected the improved conditions of island life. Young people who had grown up accepting the limitations imposed by unreliable fire and brief daylight hours found themselves inheriting a world of expanded possibilities that encouraged innovation and creativity. They began developing new techniques for metalworking, pottery, and textile production that took advantage of the consistent heat sources now available, creating objects of beauty and utility that surpassed anything their ancestors had been able to produce. But even as communities throughout Polynesia celebrated these improvements and adapted to their enhanced capabilities, Maui himself remained restlessly aware of other challenges that continued to affect his people's well-being. His divine nature compelled him to seek out problems that others might accept as unchangeable aspects of existence, always searching for solutions that could benefit not just his immediate family and community, but all the scattered populations throughout the vast Pacific region. One persistent difficulty that captured his attention involved the challenges faced by fishermen and ocean travelers who needed to navigate the vast expanses of water that separated the various island groups. While island dwellers had developed sophisticated techniques for reading currents, wind patterns, and celestial markers, the ocean remained a dangerous and unpredictable environment where even experienced navigators could become lost or overwhelmed by sudden storms. The problem was particularly acute during certain seasons when weather patterns made traditional navigation methods unreliable, forcing fishing fleets to remain close to shore when they might otherwise venture into deeper waters where larger and more valuable fish could be found. These limitations reduced the protein available to island communities, while also restricting trade and communication between different groups that might otherwise share resources and knowledge. Maui's investigation into oceanic navigation revealed that the fundamental challenge lay not in human limitations, but in the chaotic nature of ocean currents and wind patterns that seemed to shift according to no discernible logic. The sea appeared to be governed by forces that operated independently of the celestial movements that provided reliable guidance for land-based activities, creating a maritime environment where even the most skilled navigators could find themselves at the mercy of unpredictable conditions. His divine education had taught him that apparent chaos in natural systems often reflected underlying patterns that could be understood and worked with rather than simply endured. This perspective led him to consider whether the ocean's seemingly random behavior might actually follow principles that could be learned and applied to make navigation safer and more reliable. The quest for understanding oceanic forces led Maui to seek out Tangaroa, the great god of the sea, whose domain encompassed all the waters that surrounded and connected the Pacific Islands. Tangaroa was known to be a complex deity whose moods could shift as quickly as ocean weather, sometimes providing abundant fish and favorable winds, while at other times creating storms and dangerous currents that could destroy entire fleets. Unlike his previous encounters with divine beings, approaching Tangaroa required Maui to enter the god's domain as a supplicant rather than a negotiating partner, since the ocean realm was fundamentally different from the terrestrial and celestial spheres where he had achieved his earlier successes. The sea god's power was absolute within his watery kingdom, and any mortal who entered those depths did so entirely at his mercy. The preparation for this underwater journey required Maui to develop new applications of his shape-shifting abilities, transforming not merely his external appearance, but his internal nature to allow him to survive in the crushing depths where Tangaroa held court. This metamorphosis was more complete and challenging than any transformation he had previously attempted, as it required him to temporarily abandon many of the characteristics that defined his terrestrial existence. The descent into the ocean's depths carried Maui through layers of water that each possessed their own unique characteristics and inhabitants, from the sun-dappled surface waters where dolphins played to the midnight zones where strange creatures generated their own light in patterns that seemed almost like written messages. Each level presented different challenges and revelations about the complexity of oceanic systems that land dwellers rarely considered. Tangaroa's palace, when Maui finally reached it, was a marvel of underwater architecture that seemed to be constructed from living coral and flowing water itself, with chambers that shifted and changed according to the sea god's moods and intentions. The structure existed in perfect harmony with the surrounding marine environment, demonstrating a form of divine craftsmanship that integrated seamlessly with natural processes rather than imposing artificial order upon them. The sea god himself appeared as a being whose form seemed to incorporate aspects of every ocean creature, with features that flowed and changed like water itself, while maintaining an underlying majesty that spoke of power over all maritime forces. His voice carried the sound of waves breaking on distant shores, and his movements created currents that could be felt throughout the surrounding waters. Tangaroa's initial response to Maui's presence was one of amused curiosity rather than the hostility that might have been expected from such an intrusion into his private realm. The sea god had observed Maui's previous achievements with interest, recognizing in the young hero a kindred spirit who understood that meaningful change often required challenging established patterns and accepted limitations. Their conversation unfolded in the fluid manner appropriate to an underwater environment, with ideas flowing and merging like ocean currents rather than following the linear progression that characterized terrestrial discourse. Tangaroa was genuinely interested in hearing about the challenges faced by mortal navigators, as his vast perspective sometimes made it difficult for him to appreciate the practical difficulties experienced by beings whose lives were measured in decades rather than geological ages. As their dialogue progressed, Maui discovered that Tangaroa's seemingly capricious behavior actually reflected his attempts to balance numerous competing demands and influences that affected oceanic conditions. The sea god was responsible not only for surface navigation conditions, but also for deep-sea ecosystems, global weather patterns, and the complex relationships between different marine species that required constant attention and adjustment. The solution that emerged from their discussions involved creating a system of oceanic landmarks and guidance markers that would provide navigators with reliable reference points while still maintaining the dynamic balance that oceanic ecosystems required. These markers would take the form of subtle but consistent patterns in current flows, water temperature variations, and marine life distributions that trained observers could learn to read and interpret. Tangaroa agreed to establish these navigation aids throughout the Pacific, creating a network of oceanic signposts that would allow skilled navigators to determine their position and direction even during storms or periods of poor visibility. The markers would be integrated into natural oceanic processes in ways that enhanced rather than disrupted existing marine ecosystems, demonstrating the same harmony between divine intervention and natural order that had characterized Maui's previous achievements. The implementation of this oceanic navigation system required extensive collaboration between Tangaroa's vast knowledge of sea conditions and Maui's understanding of human navigational needs and capabilities. Together, they developed a comprehensive framework that would make ocean travel safer and more predictable while still preserving the sense of adventure and skill that made navigation a respected art among island peoples. The return journey to the surface provided Maui with opportunities to test and refine his understanding of the new navigational markers, as he learned to perceive the subtle indicators that Tangaroa had woven into the ocean's fabric. These signs were not immediately obvious to untrained observers, but became increasingly clear to those who approached them with proper knowledge and respect for oceanic forces. When Maui finally emerged from the depths and returned to his island home, he brought with him revolutionary knowledge that would transform maritime activities throughout Polynesia. The navigational techniques he shared with experienced sailors and fishermen opened up new possibilities for long-distance travel and deep-sea fishing that had previously been too dangerous to attempt on a regular basis. The impact of improved oceanic navigation extended far beyond simple transportation and fishing improvements, as reliable sea travel facilitated trade relationships between distant island groups that had previously maintained only sporadic contact. Communities that had developed specialized skills or resources could now engage in regular commerce with partners hundreds of miles away, creating economic opportunities and cultural exchanges that enriched all participating groups. The enhanced navigation capabilities also made it practical for island populations to establish settlements on previously uninhabited islands that had been too difficult to reach consistently, expanding the total land area available for human habitation while reducing population pressures on existing communities. These new settlements became centers for further exploration and development that extended Polynesian influence across ever wider areas of the Pacific. Young navigators who learned the new techniques found themselves able to undertake voyages that would have been considered impossibly dangerous by previous generations, opening up career opportunities and adventure possibilities that attracted the most capable and ambitious individuals from throughout the island chains. Their success, in turn, inspired others to develop complementary skills in shipbuilding, weather forecasting, and marine resource management that supported the expanding maritime activities. But Maui's achievements in expanding human capabilities and improving living conditions throughout Polynesia also attracted attention from cosmic forces that viewed such rapid changes with concern and suspicion. The divine realm operated according to principles that emphasized stability and gradual development over the kind of revolutionary improvements that Maui's interventions had produced, creating tensions that would eventually require resolution. Some cosmic authorities began to question whether Maui's well-intentioned efforts to help humanity might be disrupting natural balances that had been established for important reasons, even if those reasons were not immediately apparent to mortal observers. The concern was not that his individual achievements were harmful, but that their cumulative effect might be accelerating human development beyond the pace that cosmic order could safely accommodate. These concerns were complicated by the fact that Maui's divine heritage gave him legitimate standing within the cosmic hierarchy, making it inappropriate for other divine beings to simply override his decisions without engaging in the complex negotiations and consultations that governed relationships between supernatural entities of comparable status. The situation required careful diplomatic handling that respected both Maui's achievements and the broader cosmic principles that maintained universal stability. The emerging tensions between Maui's interventionist approach and the cosmic preference for gradual development created an underlying current of uncertainty that would influence all of his subsequent adventures, adding layers of complexity to challenges that might otherwise have been straightforward problems requiring innovative solutions. His success in improving human conditions had established him as a champion of mortal interests, but it had also positioned him as a potential challenger to established cosmic arrangements that some divine authorities considered essential for universal well-being. Despite these growing complications, Maui remained committed to his mission of helping humanity overcome the limitations and challenges that restricted their development and happiness. His divine nature compelled him to seek out problems that others might accept as unchangeable, while his genuine love for mortal people motivated him to take risks that purely rational calculation might have discouraged. The next great challenge that captured his attention involved the fundamental nature of mortality itself and the seemingly arbitrary limitations that confined human consciousness to brief lifespans that barely allowed individuals to develop their full potential before death claimed them. This ultimate limitation affected every aspect of human existence, creating a pervasive awareness of impermanence that influenced all mortal decisions and relationships. Maui's observation of human mortality revealed it to be not merely a biological process, but a complex system governed by supernatural forces that operated according to principles that had never been fully explained or justified to those who were subject to their effects. Death appeared to claim people regardless of their moral character, social contributions, or potential for future achievements, suggesting that mortality might be an artificial constraint rather than a natural necessity. His investigation into the nature of death and its cosmic governance led him toward what would become his most ambitious and dangerous undertaking, an attempt to challenge the fundamental conditions that separated mortal and immortal existence. This quest would require him to confront forces that operated at the very foundations of cosmic order, risking not only his own divine status, but potentially the stability of the entire system that governed relationships between different realms of existence. The preparation for this ultimate challenge would demand everything Maui had learned through his previous adventures, while testing the limits of both his supernatural abilities and his understanding of the complex relationships that connected mortal needs with divine responsibilities. As he began contemplating this final great deed, the gentle rhythm of ocean waves continued their eternal dance around the Pacific Islands, carrying whispers of adventures yet to come and dreams that would soon unfold beneath the star-filled tropical sky. The quest that would define Maui's ultimate legacy began not with dramatic proclamations or sudden inspiration, but with a quiet observation that gradually grew into an obsession that would consume his thoughts during the peaceful hours when others slept. He had watched countless mortal friends age and pass away, while his own divine nature remained unchanged, creating a growing awareness of the profound injustice that seemed to govern the relationship between time and consciousness throughout the Pacific Islands. During his evening walks along moonlit beaches, Maui would encounter elderly fishermen whose hands trembled as they mended nets that had once been wielded with supernatural skill, their eyes holding decades of accumulated wisdom that would soon be lost forever when death claimed their fragile mortal forms. He observed master craftspeople whose lifetime of learning could barely be passed on to apprentices before age weakened their bodies beyond to demonstrate the subtle techniques that had taken generations to perfect. The tragedy was not merely individual, but collective, as entire communities lost their most experienced members just when their guidance was most needed for navigating complex challenges that required the long perspective that only accumulated years could provide. Young leaders struggled to make decisions without the benefit of elder wisdom that had been suddenly removed by death's arbitrary timing, often repeating mistakes that previous generations had already learned to avoid. Maui's divine education had taught him to look beyond surface appearances to underlying systems and relationships, and his analysis of mortality revealed it to be governed by a supernatural entity known as Hina Keka, whose domain encompassed the transition between life and death throughout the Pacific realm. This ancient goddess operated according to principles that seemed to prioritize cosmic balance over individual merit or potential, claiming mortals according to predetermined patterns rather than considering their personal circumstances or contributions. The location of Hinakika's domain was said to exist at the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds, accessible through certain volcanic caves that served as passages between different levels of reality. These entrances were guarded by supernatural beings who tested anyone seeking audience with the goddess of death, ensuring that only those with legitimate business and adequate spiritual preparation could gain access to her presence. Unlike his previous adventures, which had involved negotiating with divine beings whose domains were clearly defined and whose interests could be understood through careful observation, approaching the goddess of death required Maui to confront forces that operated according to principles that transcended normal understanding of fairness, justice, and rational decision-making. Death was not merely another cosmic function, but the fundamental boundary that separated temporary existence from eternal mystery. The preparation for this ultimate journey required Maui to develop new applications of his shape-shifting abilities that would allow him to survive in realms where the normal laws governing life and consciousness might not apply. He needed to become something that was neither fully alive nor completely dead, existing in the liminal space where he might be able to communicate with Hina Keka without immediately falling under her jurisdiction. This transformation was the most difficult and dangerous metamorphosis Maui had ever attempted, requiring him to temporarily surrender aspects of his divine nature while retaining enough supernatural power to accomplish his mission. The process involved ancient rituals that had never been performed by anyone seeking to return from the realm of death, making him a pioneer in territories of spiritual exploration that no previous hero had dared to enter. The descent into Hinakika's domain began at a sacred volcano whose internal passages had been carved by forces that operated beyond geological time, creating corridors that led through layers of reality rather than simple physical space. The journey downward was accompanied by gradual changes in the nature of existence itself, as the familiar laws governing matter and energy gave way to principles that reflected the absolute authority of death over all living things. The landscape of the death realm was unlike anything Maui had encountered in his previous adventures, with features that seemed to exist in constant flux between different states of being. Rivers flowed upward into skies that held multiple moons, while forests of crystalline trees sang melodies that spoke directly to the soul without requiring the mediation of physical hearing. The very air seemed to pulse with the accumulated essence of all the lives that had ever ended, creating an atmosphere dense with memory and possibility. Hina Keika herself appeared as a figure whose form incorporated aspects of both ending and beginning, with features that suggested infinite age combined with eternal youth, as if she existed simultaneously at all points in the cycle that connected birth and death. So her presence commanded absolute respect, not through displays of power, but through the simple fact that she represented forces that every conscious being would eventually encounter, making her authority universal and inescapable. The initial conversation between Maui and the goddess of death unfolded with the careful formality appropriate to discussions that might determine the fundamental conditions governing mortal existence throughout the Pacific Islands. Hina Keika recognized immediately that her visitor was no ordinary supplicant, but someone whose divine heritage and previous achievements had earned him the right to question even the most basic assumptions about cosmic order. Their dialogue began not with Maui's specific concerns about mortality, but with broader questions about the purposes served by death and the principles that governed its application to different forms of consciousness. Hina Keika explained that death was not merely an ending, but a transformation that served essential functions in maintaining the balance between creation and destruction that allowed new possibilities to emerge from the conclusion of previous existences. The goddess revealed that mortality served to prevent the accumulation of consciousness beyond levels that the cosmic framework could sustainably support, ensuring that the total amount of awareness and experience within the universe remained within bounds that allowed for continued growth and development. Without death to create space for new forms of consciousness, existence would eventually become static and stagnant, preventing the innovation and creativity that gave meaning to life itself. As their discussion progressed, Maui began to understand that his desire to eliminate mortality entirely might create unintended consequences that could ultimately harm the very people he sought to help. The challenge was not to eliminate death, but to modify its application in ways that would allow mortals to achieve their full potential before their inevitable transition to whatever lay beyond physical existence. The negotiations that followed were the most complex and delicate of Maui's career, requiring him to balance his genuine concern for mortal suffering against the legitimate cosmic functions that mortality served in maintaining universal order. The solution they eventually developed involved not eliminating death, but establishing principles that would ensure it operated according to standards of fairness and meaning rather than arbitrary timing. Hina Keika agreed to implement changes that would allow mortals to live long enough to fulfill their essential purposes and pass on their accumulated wisdom to subsequent generations, while still maintaining the cycles of renewal that prevented existential stagnation. This compromise would extend human lifespans significantly while preserving the transformative aspects of mortality that contributed to cosmic vitality and growth. The implementation of these changes required modifications to the fundamental processes governing aging and disease throughout the Pacific Islands. with Hinakeka working to establish new patterns that would allow mortals to maintain their physical and mental capabilities for extended periods while still experiencing the natural conclusion that gave meaning and urgency to their choices and relationships. The return journey from the death realm provided Maui with opportunities to observe the effects of these modifications as they began to influence mortal communities throughout Polynesia. The changes were subtle but profound as people began to notice that their elders retained their vitality and wisdom for longer periods while still experiencing the natural rhythms that connected them to larger cosmic cycles. The success of Maui's negotiations with the goddess of death represented the culmination of his heroic career, demonstrating that even the most fundamental aspects of existence could be modified through proper understanding and respectful collaboration with the divine forces that governed cosmic order. His achievements had transformed life throughout the Pacific Islands in ways that would benefit countless generations of island peoples, but the magnitude of Maui's interventions in cosmic affairs had also created tensions and complications that would eventually require resolution through dramatic events that would test not only his own abilities, but the stability of the entire system of relationships between mortal and divine realms. His success in improving human conditions had established him as a champion of mortal interests, but it had also positioned him as a potential disruptor of cosmic balances that some divine authorities considered essential. The growing concerns among cosmic authorities about the pace and scope of changes that Maui had introduced led to increasing scrutiny of his activities and growing pressure for him to accept limitations on his future interventions in mortal affairs. These pressures created internal conflicts for Maui, who found himself torn between his desire to continue helping humanity and his recognition that unlimited intervention might ultimately prove counterproductive. The resolution of these tensions would require Maui to make choices about his future role that would determine not only his own destiny, but the long-term relationship between divine and mortal realms throughout the Pacific Islands. The decisions he faced involved questions about the proper limits of heroic intervention and the responsibilities that accompanied supernatural abilities. As communities throughout Polynesia continued to adapt to the improvements that Maui's adventures had brought to their lives, they remained largely unaware of the cosmic tensions that surrounded their heroes' achievements. The extended daylight hours, reliable fire, improved navigation, and longer lifespans had become accepted aspects of their daily experience, creating new possibilities for cultural development and personal fulfillment that previous generations could never have imagined. The children who grew up in this transformed world possessed capabilities and opportunities that far exceeded those available to their ancestors, but they also faced expectations and responsibilities that reflected their enhanced circumstances. The improvements that Maui had negotiated created not just benefits, but also new forms of obligation, as communities with greater capabilities were expected to achieve correspondingly greater accomplishments. The long-term effects of Maui's interventions continued to unfold in ways that sometimes surprised even him, as the improvements he had introduced interacted with each other and with existing cultural patterns to create emergent possibilities that no one had anticipated. The combination of extended daylight, reliable fire, and improved navigation created synergistic effects that multiplied the benefits of each individual achievement. Trade networks expanded beyond anything previously possible, as communities could now maintain contact across vast distances while producing surplus goods during extended working hours that reliable fire made practical. The economic prosperity that resulted from these improvements supported population growth and cultural elaboration that transformed island societies in fundamental ways. The artistic and intellectual achievements that emerged from these improved conditions reflected the creative potential that had always existed within Polynesian communities, but had been constrained by practical limitations that Maui's adventures had systematically removed. Poetry, music, craftsmanship, and philosophical inquiry flourished as people gained the time and resources necessary for pursuing activities beyond basic survival needs. But the very success of these transformations created new challenges and expectations that required continued innovation and adaptation from communities that were still learning to navigate their enhanced capabilities. The rapid changes that Maui's interventions had introduced sometimes created social tensions between traditionalists who preferred established ways of life and innovators who sought to maximize the potential of their improved circumstances. The resolution of these social tensions required the development of new forms of leadership and governance that could balance respect for traditional wisdom with openness to beneficial innovations. Community leaders found themselves needing to make decisions about complex issues that their predecessors had never faced, often without clear precedents or established procedures to guide their choices. The wisdom traditions that had guided island societies for generations required updating and expansion to address the new possibilities and responsibilities that Maui's achievements had created. Elders and spiritual leaders worked to develop ethical frameworks and practical guidelines that could help their communities navigate the challenges of prosperity and expanded capabilities while maintaining the cultural values that defined their identities. The educational systems that prepared young people for adult responsibilities needed fundamental restructuring to address the broader range of opportunities and obligations that existed in the transformed world that Maui's adventures had created. Traditional apprenticeships and informal learning arrangements were supplemented with more systematic approaches to knowledge transmission that could handle the increased complexity of contemporary life. The religious and ceremonial practices that connected island communities to their spiritual foundations required careful adaptation to acknowledge the new relationships between mortal and divine realms that Maui's negotiations had established. Rituals and observances were modified to honor the cosmic authorities who had cooperated with Maui's efforts while maintaining proper respect for the natural order that continued to govern essential aspects of existence. The stories and legends that preserved cultural memory and transmitted values to future generations gradually incorporated accounts of Maui's adventures, creating new mythological frameworks that explained the origins of improved conditions while providing moral guidance for those who inherited the benefits of his heroic deeds. These narratives served both as entertainment and as instruction, helping community members understand their place in the larger cosmic order that Maui's actions had helped to reshape. As the immediate effects of Maui's major adventures became integrated into the normal patterns of island life, attention began to focus on the more subtle and long-term implications of his interventions in cosmic affairs. The changes he had negotiated with various divine authorities were not merely temporary improvements, but fundamental modifications to the conditions governing human existence throughout the Pacific realm. The extended lifespans that his negotiations with Hinakeka had made possible created opportunities for individuals to develop expertise and wisdom to unprecedented levels, but they also raised questions about the proper use of extended time and the responsibilities that accompanied enhanced longevity. Communities needed to develop new approaches to career development, family relationships, and social organization that could accommodate the reality of significantly longer individual lifespans. The reliable fire that his journey to the underworld had secured made possible forms of technology and craftsmanship that had previously been impractical, but it also required communities to develop new safety practices and regulatory frameworks that could prevent the misuse of enhanced fire-making capabilities. The power that Maui had obtained from Mahuika needed to be managed responsibly to avoid accidents or conflicts that could harm rather than benefit island populations. The improved oceanic navigation that his negotiations with Tangaroa had established opened up possibilities for exploration and settlement that extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of Polynesian influence, but it also created obligations to use these capabilities wisely and to maintain respectful relationships with any new peoples or territories that might be encountered during expanded voyaging activities. The longer daylight hours that his confrontation with the sun had achieved provided time for activities and developments that had never been possible before, but they also created expectations for productivity and achievement that sometimes placed stress on individuals and communities that were still adapting to their enhanced circumstances. The gift of extended daylight needed to be balanced with adequate rest and reflection to maintain psychological and spiritual well-being. The larger islands that his fishing expeditions had created provided space for population growth and agricultural expansion that relieved many traditional constraints on community development, but they also required new approaches to land management and resource allocation that could ensure sustainable use of enhanced territories. The additional land that Maui had pulled from the ocean floor needed to be developed thoughtfully to maximize its benefits while preserving environmental balance. As these long-term implications of Maui's adventures continued to unfold, the hero himself began to contemplate the next phase of his relationship with both mortal and divine realms. His unprecedented success in negotiating improvements to human conditions had established him as a unique figure whose influence extended across multiple domains of existence, but it had also created expectations and responsibilities that required careful consideration of future actions and commitments. The cosmic authorities who had cooperated with Maui's previous efforts maintained ongoing interest in monitoring the effects of the changes they had authorized, ensuring that the improvements they had agreed to provide continued to serve beneficial purposes without creating unintended disruptions to universal order. Their oversight created a framework of accountability that influenced how Maui approached potential future interventions in cosmic affairs. The mortal communities throughout Polynesia, who had benefited from Maui's achievements, looked to him as a continuing source of leadership and problem-solving capability, expecting him to address new challenges as they emerged and to continue advocating for their interests in dealings with supernatural forces. Their expectations created ongoing pressure for Maui to remain actively engaged in improving human conditions rather than retiring to enjoy his previous successes. The balance between these various expectations and obligations would determine the character of Maui's future adventures and the ultimate legacy of his heroic career. As the gentle trade winds continued to carry the scents of tropical flowers across the peaceful lagoons where island families gathered for evening meals around reliable fires, the stage was set for the final chapters of a story that had already transformed life throughout the vast Pacific realm in ways that would influence countless generations of island peoples yet to come. The delicate equilibrium that Maui had established through his negotiations with cosmic authorities began to reveal new dimensions of complexity as the seasons turned and the full implications of his achievements became apparent to both mortal and divine observers. The hero who had once acted primarily on instinct and immediate compassion now found himself navigating intricate webs of consequence and responsibility that extended far beyond the original scope of his interventions. In the months following his return from the realm of death, Maui noticed subtle changes in how other supernatural beings regarded him during his travels between islands. Where once he had been viewed as an ambitious young hero testing the boundaries of possibility, he was now recognized as a force capable of fundamentally altering the established order that governed relationships between different levels of existence. This recognition brought both respect and wariness from divine entities who had previously dismissed his activities as temporary disruptions to cosmic routine. The transformation in his reputation became particularly evident during a journey to visit remote island communities that had recently begun experiencing the benefits of his various achievements. As his canoe approached a settlement where the extended daylight hours had enabled unprecedented artistic and cultural flowering, Maui observed unusual celestial phenomena that suggested his presence was being monitored by supernatural authorities whose interest in his activities had intensified significantly. The night sky above the island displayed aurora patterns that were not typical for the tropical latitudes, with streaming lights that moved in configurations that seemed to carry encoded messages between different celestial realms. These luminous displays were accompanied by subtle changes in star positions that indicated the attention of navigational deities who served as cosmic record keepers, documenting significant events that might influence future developments in divine-mortal relationships. Upon reaching the island, Maui was greeted by community leaders whose expressions combined gratitude for the improvements his efforts had brought with underlying concern about the sustainability of changes that seemed almost too beneficial to be permanent. The village chief, an elderly woman whose extended lifespan reflected the modifications Hinakeka had implemented, spoke of dreams and visions that suggested the cosmic order was preparing for significant adjustments that might affect the continuation of their enhanced circumstances. Her concerns were not unfounded, as Maui's supernatural senses could detect increasing tensions within the divine realm that reflected growing debate about the precedence his successful interventions had established. Some cosmic authorities viewed his achievements as positive developments that demonstrated the potential for beneficial cooperation between mortal and immortal realms, while others worried that the rapid pace of change he had introduced might destabilize fundamental principles that had governed universal order for eons. The complexity of these divine politics became more apparent during a series of encounters with minor supernatural beings who served as messengers and intermediaries between different levels of cosmic hierarchy. These entities, who normally maintained careful neutrality in disputes between major divine powers, began approaching Maui with increasing frequency to convey subtle warnings and suggestions about the need for caution in any future interventions he might contemplate. One particularly significant encounter occurred during a fishing expedition when Maui was approached by a school of dolphins whose behavior indicated they carried messages from Tangaroa regarding oceanic conditions that were beginning to reflect the broader cosmic tensions surrounding his activities. The sea god's communication, transmitted through complex patterns of dolphin movement and vocalization, suggested that while the navigation improvements remained beneficial and stable, other divine authorities were questioning whether the cumulative effect of all his interventions might be creating imbalances that required corrective action. The message was carefully worded to avoid direct criticism of Maui's previous achievements, while conveying the sea god's concern that future cosmic politics might become more restrictive if divine authorities concluded that unlimited heroic intervention posed risks to universal stability. Tangaroa's advice emphasized the importance of maintaining respectful relationships with all cosmic powers and considering the long-term implications of any additional modifications to established natural order. Similar communications began arriving through various supernatural channels as the divine beings who had previously cooperated with Maui's efforts sought to prepare him for the changing political climate within cosmic hierarchy. The sun, whose daily journey now provided the extended daylight hours that had transformed island productivity, sent messages through unusual cloud formations that suggested growing pressure from other celestial authorities who questioned whether solar modifications had created precedents that might encourage inappropriate interventions in other cosmic functions. Even Mahuika, the grandmother of fire who had shared her divine flames with mortal communities, used volcanic activity patterns to communicate concerns about the sustainability of her cooperation with Maui's mission if other underworld authorities decided that such collaboration violated fundamental principles governing the separation between divine and mortal realms. Her warnings were particularly troubling because they suggested that the most powerful cosmic forces were beginning to view his achievements not as isolated successes, but as components of a larger pattern that might threaten established order. The accumulation of these warnings and concerns created within Maui a growing awareness that his future actions would need to be guided by considerations that extended far beyond immediate benefits to mortal communities. His success in improving human conditions had established him as a figure whose decisions could influence the fundamental relationships between different levels of existence, creating responsibilities that required wisdom and restraint to match his supernatural capabilities. This recognition led Maui to seek guidance from his divine grandfather, Tamanui Kiterangi, whose cosmic perspective and accumulated wisdom might provide insights into navigating the complex political and philosophical challenges that his achievements had created. The journey to reach his grandfather's celestial domain required Maui to employ shape-shifting abilities that carried him beyond the normal boundaries of the physical world into realms where space and time operated according to principles that reflected pure consciousness rather than material limitations. The reunion between grandfather and grandson took place in a crystalline pavilion that existed at the intersection of multiple cosmic dimensions, allowing them to observe the effects of Maui's interventions from perspectives that encompassed not only immediate consequences, but also long-term implications that stretched across generations and influenced the fundamental structure of reality itself. From this elevated vantage point, the true scope and significance of his achievements became apparent in ways that earthbound observation could never reveal. Tamanui Kiterangi's analysis of the situation confirmed many of Maui's growing concerns, while also revealing additional layers of complexity that even his supernatural awareness had not fully appreciated. The modifications he had negotiated with various divine authorities had indeed created beneficial changes for mortal communities, but they had also established precedents and expectations that were beginning to influence cosmic politics in ways that could ultimately affect the stability of the entire system governing divine mortal relationships. The divine grandfather explained that cosmic order depended upon maintaining delicate balances between opposing forces and competing interests that required constant adjustment and negotiation among supernatural authorities. Maui's unprecedented success in advocating for mortal interests had shifted these balances in ways that were still generating ripple effects throughout different levels of divine hierarchy, creating both opportunities for further beneficial cooperation and risks of backlash from cosmic forces that felt their traditional prerogatives had been challenged. The guidance that emerged from their extended consultations emphasized the need for Maui to transition from his previous role as an active interventionist to a more diplomatic position that could help maintain and protect the improvements he had already achieved while avoiding actions that might provoke restrictive responses from cosmic authorities. This transition would require him to develop new skills in political negotiation and strategic patience that could complement his existing abilities in direct problem solving and supernatural confrontation. The implementation of this new approach began with a series of diplomatic initiatives designed to strengthen Maui's relationships with divine authorities who had previously cooperated with his efforts, while also building bridges to cosmic powers who had remained neutral or skeptical regarding his interventions. These diplomatic efforts required him to demonstrate not only his continued respect for cosmic order, but also his understanding of the legitimate concerns that his achievements had raised among supernatural authorities. One of the most important diplomatic challenges involved addressing the concerns of celestial powers who governed aspects of natural order that Maui had not directly modified, but whose functions were indirectly affected by the changes he had negotiated. These authorities worried that the precedents his successes had established might encourage other heroes or supernatural beings to attempt similar interventions in their domains, potentially creating cascading disruptions that could destabilize universal order beyond any individual's ability to control or correct. The resolution of these concerns required Maui to participate in formal cosmic councils where divine authorities could express their reservations and work together to establish guidelines for future interactions between heroic figures and cosmic forces. These councils operated according to protocols that had evolved over cosmic ages to handle disputes and negotiations between supernatural beings whose actions could affect universal stability, requiring Maui to master diplomatic arts that were as complex and demanding as any of his previous heroic achievements. The proceedings of these cosmic councils revealed the extraordinary complexity of the supernatural political system that governed relationships between different levels of existence throughout the Pacific realm and beyond. Divine authorities were organized into intricate hierarchies based on their domains of influence and their roles in maintaining various aspects of cosmic order, with elaborate procedures for consultation and consensus building that ensured major decisions reflected the considered judgment of all relevant powers. Maui's participation in these councils provided him with unprecedented insights into the cosmic perspective on his achievements, while also demonstrating his commitment to working within established divine institutions, rather than continuing to operate as an independent agent whose actions might conflict with broader supernatural policies. His willingness to submit his future activities to collaborative oversight helped address many of the concerns that had been raised about the precedents his interventions had established. The outcomes of these diplomatic efforts included the establishment of new protocols for heroic intervention in cosmic affairs that would allow beneficial modifications to continue while preventing disruptions that might threaten universal stability. These protocols recognized Maui's unique status as a bridge between mortal and divine realms, while also establishing safeguards that would prevent the misuse of similar capabilities by less qualified or less responsible individuals. The successful conclusion of these negotiations marked a new phase in Maui's relationship with both mortal communities and divine authorities, as he transitioned from his role as an active problem solver to a position as guardian and protector of the improvements he had already achieved. This new role required different skills and approaches while still allowing him to serve the interests of the island peoples who had benefited from his previous interventions. The communities throughout Polynesia gradually adapted to this transition in Maui's activities, recognizing that the benefits of his previous achievements were now permanently integrated into their daily lives, while understanding that future improvements would need to emerge through their own efforts and development rather than through continued heroic intervention. This recognition encouraged greater self-reliance and innovation as the island societies learned to maximize the potential of the enhanced circumstances that Maui's adventures had created. The artistic and cultural renaissance that flourished in communities blessed with extended daylight hours, reliable fire, improved navigation capabilities, and longer lifespans began producing works of unprecedented beauty and sophistication that reflected the creative potential that had always existed within Polynesian societies but had been constrained by practical limitations. These cultural achievements served as lasting monuments to the transformative power of Maui's interventions, while demonstrating humanity's capacity for growth when provided with adequate resources and opportunities. And so, As the final echoes of Maui's legendary adventures drift across the star-kissed waters of the Pacific, we reach the gentle conclusion of our journey through the timeless mythology of Polynesia. Through extended daylight that still graces these islands, through the reliable flames that warm moteless hearths, through the navigational wisdom that guides voyagers across vast oceanic expanses, and through the precious gift of extended life itself, Maui's legacy continues to shape the world in ways both seen and unseen. His transformation from mischievous trickster to cosmic diplomat reminds us that true heroism lies not merely in the grand gestures of intervention, but in the wisdom to know when action serves the greater good. As sleep now claims you, may your dreams be filled with the gentle trade winds of transformation, the warm glow of divine fire, and the endless possibilities that await when courage meets compassion beneath the Southern Cross.